Chapter 26. Shadows of Justice and Light of Discovery, Part 3. The room fell into a heavy silence as the soft hum of the communication device filled the space between the party and the world police. A cool, mechanical voice issued from the transmitter before the screen flickered to life, revealing the first of several representatives from the world police. A stern-faced man appeared, his dark uniform and the cold, authoritative presence of the WP unmistakable. Behind him, the faint outline of towering skyscrapers could be seen through a rain-streaked window. The cityscape of the Central Lands served as a reminder of the power the world police wielded over vast regions. "Lucas," the officer's voice was crisp, unyielding. "We've been monitoring your movements. The world police demands your immediate surrender. You and your companions have been marked as enemies of the state. Return to our jurisdiction and face justice for your actions." A chill rippled through the group as they heard the ultimatum. Lucas, standing at the forefront of the party, stiffened. Beside him, Thomas stood with his arms crossed, the expression on his face one of cautious calm. Mina's eyes narrowed, her fists unconsciously clenching at her sides, her breath shallow. "This is how you speak to those you once saw as heroes?" Thomas's voice broke the tension, cutting through the formalities with a sharp edge. He stepped forward, his eyes never leaving the screen. "We came to Brum'korath seeking nothing but to end the threat you cannot even begin to comprehend, and now you demand we surrender? You label us as enemies for doing the right thing?" "Your actions in Brum'korath and the subsequent events in Kingston have created a rift." The officer's voice was measured, but beneath it, there was the unmistakable hint of an underlying threat. "The explosion in Kingston, the destruction, the chaos, these are not the actions of heroes. The people you've hurt, the lives you've endangered, those consequences will not go ignored. You will stand trial or face the consequences of defying the world police." Mina's breath caught in her throat. She took a slow step forward, her usual bravado now tempered by a sense of urgency she hadn't anticipated. "You're wrong. We didn't cause that explosion, or any of it. It wasn't us. It's something we—" She broke off, remembering the visions and the blankness that had plagued her since the event. "I don't care what you think happened," the officer interrupted sharply, a dangerous note creeping into his voice. "What matters is the fact that you've become a threat, and I'm giving you one final chance to comply. If you do not surrender, you will be declared enemies of the state. If you do not stand trial voluntarily, the world police will hunt you down. Your freedom will not be allowed to stand." The screen flickered again, and another voice joined the conversation. This one belonged to a woman, dressed in the same dark uniform but with a softer, more measured demeanor. Her tone lacked the same cold certainty as the first officer, but her words carried weight nonetheless. "You must understand the position you put us in, Lucas," she said, addressing him directly. "The world police will not tolerate defiance, not from anyone. Your actions, whether intentional or not, have shaken the delicate balance of power. You now stand on the precipice of something much larger than yourselves. The time to submit is now." Lucas felt the weight of her words settle on him. There was no mistaking it, the stakes had just risen. They weren't just being warned anymore, they were being coerced. It wasn't just a trial that awaited them now, it was the full might of the world police, and they were no longer sure they could trust anyone, not even the forces that had once been allies. "We stand firm," Lucas said, his voice steady but laced with the tension that threatened to unravel his calm exterior. "We have done nothing wrong, and we will not submit to your demands. We will continue on our mission. The world police does not dictate our actions." Thomas nodded beside him, his jaw set with a quiet resolve. He had grown accustomed to the weight of responsibility, but this was different. This wasn't just about protecting their lives. It was about maintaining the fragile integrity of their quest. The world police had crossed a line, and they wouldn't back down now. "Whatever you may think of us," Thomas continued, "you have no right to call us criminals. We fought to protect lives, not destroy them. If you want to label us as enemies, so be it. But we are not your prisoners. We'll face the consequences of your accusations, but on our terms, not yours." There was a pause. The two officers exchanged glances, and for a moment it seemed like they might push harder. Instead, the man who had first spoken cleared his throat and leaned forward slightly. "This is your last warning," he said. "You and your companions are marked. The world police will see you as enemies from this moment forward. Know that wherever you go, we will be watching. We will not hesitate to act if you threaten the safety of the people." The tension in the room grew palpable, and Lucas could feel it in his gut, a sensation that told him the world police would not forget this confrontation. Their response wasn't just a warning, it was a declaration of war. With a final, lingering stare, the screen went dark, leaving the room in an unsettling silence. "We're on our own now," Lucas said quietly, his voice heavy. He looked at Thomas and then to Mina, whose face was pale but determined. She had felt it too, the weight of the future bearing down on them all. "They've made their move," Thomas replied, voice taut. "We can't afford to second-guess ourselves now. We have to stay the course, no matter what comes next." Mina stepped closer to them both, eyes hard. "I've never been afraid of the law, but this is something else. We've been given a choice, and I'm not backing down." Lucas met her gaze, and for a moment he let himself believe they might be able to handle whatever came next. But deep down, he knew the path ahead was no longer just about surviving the next fight. It was about standing tall in the face of a looming, unstoppable force. As the weight of the decision settled over them, a strange sense of unity formed between the three of them. There was no turning back. The choice had been made, the lines had been drawn, enemies of the state. The silence that followed the world police's ultimatum was thick with tension, each member of the party processing the gravity of the situation in their own way. The virtual meeting room, with its cold and clinical lighting, felt more like a courtroom than a place for negotiation. The weight of the world police's demand hung heavy in the air, and for a moment it seemed as if the party might crumble under the pressure. But Thomas, ever the strategist, refused to let that happen. His jaw tightened, and with a deep breath, he stepped forward, both physically and mentally, into the role of spokesperson for the group. He knew this was not just a matter of words. This was about survival. The world police would stop at nothing to bend them to their will, but Thomas wasn't going to let that happen without a fight. "We have nothing to hide," Thomas began, his voice steady but firm. His eyes remained locked on the screen, where the two world police officers now stood in judgment. "We are not criminals, and we won't stand by while you paint us as such. Yes, there was the explosion in Kingston, but we had nothing to do with it. We were targeted by something much larger than we can even comprehend, and we're still trying to understand the truth of it. You have no idea what we're up against." His words were calculated but passionate, the perfect balance of diplomacy and force. He wanted the world police to understand that the party wasn't just a group of fugitives on the run. They were individuals caught in the middle of a battle they had not started, and they had a duty to finish it. His gaze never wavered, his posture unyielding. "This mission we're on, it's bigger than all of us," Thomas continued, his tone hardening slightly. "We don't have the luxury of complying with your demands. You might think of us as rebels, as criminals, but we're fighting something far worse than your bureaucracy. The world is on the brink of something catastrophic, and we're trying to prevent it. That's why we can't submit to your jurisdiction, not when lives are at stake." The officers exchanged a brief, unreadable glance. The man who had spoken earlier regarded Thomas with an icy expression, his lips pressed into a tight line. It was clear that Thomas's words hadn't convinced him. They never would. The world police weren't interested in the nuances of the party's mission. They only cared about control. But Mina wouldn't let the meeting end with Thomas's voice alone. She stepped forward, her presence magnetic. Her blue eyes sparkled with a mix of determination and defiance, her posture as fierce as ever. "Thomas is right," she added, her voice ringing with unwavering conviction. "We're not here to answer to you. We didn't ask for your involvement, and we sure as hell don't need it now. We've fought our way through enough to know that we can't trust anyone who claims to have the answers. The only thing we trust is each other and our mission." Mina's words hung in the air, and for a brief moment, the tension in the room shifted. Her unapologetic defiance and her refusal to back down were infectious, spreading through the group like wildfire. She made it clear that the party would not be swayed by threats or ultimatums. This was their path, and nothing would stop them from walking it. "Don't misunderstand me," Mina continued, her voice taking on a sharp edge. "We're not afraid of the world police, but we are afraid of what will happen if we don't follow through on this mission. We're not just running from the law, we're fighting for the future. You want us to surrender? Not happening." Lucas, who had remained mostly silent up to this point, shifted his weight slightly, still standing in the background. He wasn't quite as vocal as Thomas or Mina, but that didn't mean he wasn't engaged in the conversation. His mind was working in overdrive, processing everything that had been said, absorbing the layers of unspoken meaning behind the words. He didn't just hear the threat in the officer's tone. He felt it. There was something more beneath the surface, something he couldn't quite place, but it sent a chill down his spine. He had never been one to rush to action without thinking things through. Even now, as Thomas and Mina fought for their right to remain free, Lucas found himself pulling back and observing, piecing together the hidden motives of the world police. They weren't just concerned with the explosion in Kingston. They were concerned with the party's potential to disrupt their control. And that meant the party had something valuable, something they couldn't afford to lose. But Lucas wasn't going to show his hand. Not yet. The world police were just as dangerous when they thought they had all the answers, and if he revealed his own suspicions, it could put them all at risk. He had to be patient, calculating. The telepathic connection he shared with Mina helped him stay grounded, but it also kept him acutely aware of her own anxieties. She wasn't as quick to trust as she seemed, not when it came to the powers pulling the strings behind the scenes. And yet, despite his quiet observations, Lucas couldn't ignore the sense of unity that had blossomed among them. They were standing together, firm in their resolve. Whatever doubts had plagued him in the past, whatever fears had gnawed at him, were now eclipsed by something stronger. He could feel it in the way Thomas's voice had steadied, in the way Mina had stepped forward, her eyes ablaze with purpose. They weren't just surviving anymore, they were fighting back. They were a team. The officers on the screen seemed to sense the same shift. There was a flicker of uncertainty in their eyes, a brief moment when the air seemed to crackle with the weight of unspoken words. They hadn't expected such a unified response, not from a group of so-called fugitives. The world police had underestimated them. But as the conversation continued, it became clear that the party's refusal to comply was not an option the officers were willing to accept. They could feel the walls closing in, the inevitable clash of wills that would come if they didn't retreat or bend. And yet, the party was unwavering. "We will not surrender," Thomas repeated, his voice steady. "We will do what we must, and we'll face whatever comes next, together." The world police officers exchanged a final glance, their expressions hardening. "Very well," the man said, "but remember this. Your defiance will be noted. You will be hunted. The consequences will follow, no matter where you go." With that, the screen flickered off, leaving the room in an oppressive silence. But for Lucas, Mina, and Thomas, the silence was not oppressive. It was empowering. They had drawn their line in the sand. They were united, not just in the struggle ahead, but in the truth of what they were fighting for. "We're not backing down," Mina said, breaking the silence, her voice tinged with quiet satisfaction. "No," Thomas agreed. "And now they'll know exactly who they're dealing with." In that moment, Lucas felt a surge of something he hadn't felt in a long time. Confidence. They had made their stand. They were ready for whatever came next. The virtual meeting ended with an unmistakable finality. The screen went black, but the oppressive weight of the conversation lingered in the room, heavy and suffocating. The officers of the world police had made their position clear. Enemies of the state. The words echoed in Lucas's mind, reverberating with a sharpness that seemed to cut through the stillness of the moment. They weren't just fugitives anymore. They weren't just running from a misunderstanding. They were now official outlaws, branded with the mark of treason. The full weight of it hadn't quite hit him yet, but it would. It had to. "Enemies of the state," Thomas muttered, his voice rough with frustration as he ran a hand through his hair. "Is that what we've become?" The question hung in the air, but no one answered. It didn't need an answer. Everyone understood the magnitude of the situation. Their refusal to comply had sealed their fate. The world police were a formidable force, with far-reaching influence and an iron grip on the central lands. They had no intention of letting this stand. Their declaration wasn't just a formality, it was a sentence. The party was now marked for destruction. Mina leaned against the wall, her arms crossed, her gaze distant. She was tense, but there was a flicker of something else beneath the surface. A resolve, perhaps, but also the unmistakable sting of uncertainty. What would the world police do now? What was their next move? She spoke first, breaking the silence. Well, that's it then. We're officially enemies of the state. Does it matter? Thomas's voice was sharp, his gaze meeting hers. They've already been hunting us, Mina. This just makes it official. But now it's different. Her voice was quiet, almost a whisper, but it carried the weight of her concerns. We've gone from being fugitives to being targets, not just of Brum'korath, but of the world police. And we're marked for something bigger, something far more dangerous. Lucas stood at the back of the room, his eyes drifting to the window. The city outside was alive with motion, oblivious to the fact that they were now enemies to a power that controlled much of the world. Enemies of the state. The words filled his mind with questions, none of which he could answer yet. Why had they been marked so decisively? Was it just their defiance, or was there more? The world police had never been known to take such swift and public action. Something had changed. Something bigger was at play here. He felt Mina's unease echoing in his mind, a subtle undercurrent to their telepathic connection, a reminder that their unity and resolve would be tested in ways they hadn't yet imagined. The future loomed before them like an open, uncharted sea, and the storm clouds on the horizon were thick with uncertainty. We're not the only ones who will pay for this, Lucas said quietly, his voice soft but carrying a weight of its own. There are forces out there that want to use us, to manipulate us. They're all watching now, waiting for the right moment. Thomas turned toward him, his brow furrowed in thought. What do you mean? The world police isn't acting alone, Lucas continued. They're just a part of the larger picture, a much bigger game. The sent ones. The prophecy. This isn't just about us. They've been watching us for years, testing us, and now we've crossed a line. A dangerous one. Mina's eyes widened as she processed his words. The implications were enormous. She knew they weren't just fighting for their own survival anymore. They were caught in something far deeper, something that reached beyond the borders of Brum'korath and the central lands. And what does that mean for us? She asked, her voice tinged with concern. We've already been marked as enemies. What happens next? Thomas paced across the room, his mind working furiously. What it means is that we can't trust anyone. Not even the dwarves. Not the elves. Not the world police. No one. They all have their own agendas, their own games to play. And we're nothing more than pawns in it. The tension in the room thickened, as if the very air around them had become charged with static. Lucas's mind was already racing ahead, processing the information at an alarming speed. Enemies of the state. That was the first step. The next would be the tightening of the noose. The world police would make sure they couldn't escape their reach. And if that wasn't enough, there were other factions at play. Factions that would move in the shadows, watching their every move, waiting for the moment to strike. The world police won't stop at just labeling us enemies, Lucas said, his voice low, barely above a whisper. They'll hunt us. They'll do whatever it takes to break us. And there's no telling who else will join them. There are bigger forces out there. Cultists, political powers, maybe even factions within the world police itself. They'll try to use us, control us, and they'll destroy anyone who gets in their way. Mina looked up at him, her expression a mix of determination and worry. So what do we do now? We keep moving, Thomas said, his voice cold and resolute. We keep pushing forward. We do what we have to do, and we don't look back. We fight for the future, for the people who don't have a voice, for the ones who need us. That's all we can do now. A heavy silence fell over them as his words settled in. The stakes had been raised. They weren't just fighting for survival anymore. They were fighting for something much bigger, something they didn't fully understand, but something they knew they couldn't ignore. And now, With the world police against them, there was no going back. As Lucas gazed out the window, the city sprawled beneath him, seemingly indifferent to the storm brewing in the distance. He didn't know what the future held, but one thing was certain. The party's defiance had set something into motion, and they would have to face the consequences, whatever they might be. But for now, there was only one choice left. Keep moving forward, stay united, and prepare for the inevitable confrontation that was coming. The world police had declared them enemies. And that was just the beginning. The storm had only begun to gather.